For 40 years, one room inside an old American estate remained locked. No guests were allowed near it, no servants were permitted to enter, and no one in the town was ever told why. When the owners died, renovation workers were finally sent upstairs to force the door open. Inside, they found a room preserved exactly as it had been decades earlier. A neatly made bed, personal belongings untouched, and journals revealing that a child had been hidden there in secret. But what unsettled the workers most was this: the child had died decades before. Yet inside the dust there were fresh footprints, and the rocking chair was still moving. The room had remained untouched for so long that many believed whatever was inside had been forgotten. But the discovery inside that upstairs bedroom told a very different story. The journals found in the room suggested that the estate's owners had hidden the existence of their eldest child from everyone around them. For years, the child had lived in secret. Inside a locked room no one was allowed to enter. No visitors knew. No records in town mentioned the child. And no one outside the family was supposed to find out. Yet even after the room was opened and the truth was uncovered, some details made no sense. The bed looked recently arranged. The dust on the floor held footprints no one could explain. And workers inside the house reported hearing movement upstairs after the room had already been searched. The hidden room revealed a tragic secret. But it also raised a question no one could answer. If no one had entered that room for decades, then what had left those footprints behind? To understand how that question began, we have to go back to the years when the estate was still full of life, when the locked room was just one quiet rule in a house filled with silence. Because long before the room was opened, the people who lived there had already begun to notice that something about it was not right. The estate stood on the edge of a quiet rural town, surrounded by open fields, narrow country roads, and acres of land that had long been left to grow wild. Tall grass covered what had once been carefully maintained gardens. Stone walls built decades earlier bordered the property, worn by rain and time. Trees lined the long entrance road, their branches stretching over the path as if closing the estate off from the outside world. From a distance, the house still carried the dignity it once had. It was large, built in an older American style, with broad windows, high ceilings, and enough rooms to hold generations of family history. To the people living nearby, it had always been known simply as the Harrow Estate. For years, the property belonged to one of the most respected families in the county. The owners, Edward and Margaret Harrow, were known as private but respectable people. They had lived in the house for decades, keeping mostly to themselves, while maintaining the image of a quiet, wealthy household. In town, the Harrow name carried influence. They contributed to local churches, supported community projects, and were spoken of with the kind of respect reserved for families whose roots stretched back generations. To outsiders, the estate seemed peaceful, orderly, traditional. A family home untouched by scandal. Edward and Margaret had only one child, a daughter named Eleanor, who was expected to inherit everything. She grew up on the estate, surrounded by its routines, its silence, and its rules. And among those rules, one stood above all the others. There was one room in the house that remained permanently locked. It was located on the upper floor at the far end of a long hallway lined with family portraits and unused guest rooms. The house had dozens of rooms, bedrooms, studies, storage spaces, servant quarters, but that one upstairs room was never opened. Not for guests, not for family friends, not even for household staff. And visitors who stayed at the estate were told not to go near the far end of the upper hallway. Servants cleaned every part of the house except for that room. And if anyone asked about it, the answer was always brief. The room was private, nothing more was said. Over time, the silence surrounding that locked door became part of the estate's identity. People in town knew about it, but no one openly discussed it. In a place where tradition mattered and certain families were not questioned, curiosity stayed quiet. The Harrows were respected. Their privacy was left alone. And so the locked room became something locals accepted without explanation. Children in town heard stories about it from their parents. Delivery workers noticed the sealed door during rare visits inside the home. Former staff remembered being warned to stay away from that section of the upstairs hall. Yet no one could say what was inside, and no one seemed willing to ask. For decades, life at the estate continued that way. The Harrows grew older, the house grew quieter, the gardens became harder to maintain, and the locked room remained exactly as it had always been: sealed, avoided, and unexplained. Then Edward and Margaret died within a few years of each other, leaving the property to their daughter, Eleanor. By then, the estate was beginning to show its age. The cost of maintaining the large property had become overwhelming. Repairs had been postponed for years. Parts of the house sat unused. Eleanor no longer had the resources to keep the estate as it had been in her parents' time. Eventually, she made the decision to begin renovations, and it was the first major work the house had seen in decades. Local contractors were brought in to repair damaged walls, replace old wiring, and restore sections of the aging property. For the workers, it was just another renovation job on an old estate. But as they moved through the upstairs rooms, they noticed something unusual. At the far end of the hallway was a door that stood apart from the others. Its frame was older. Its lock had been reinforced, and according to the owner, it had not been opened in over 40 years. The workers asked what was inside. Eleanor gave no clear answer. She only repeated what had always been said. The room was to remain closed. By then, even she seemed to know very little about what had been left behind that door. The instruction had passed from one generation to the next without explanation. But restoring the estate meant opening every sealed space, repairing every damaged wall, and inspecting every room. For the first time in 40 years, the locked upstairs room could no longer remain untouched. And when the decision was finally made to open it, no one expected that the room would appear as though time had stopped inside. Long before the estate fell into silence, life inside the house followed a rhythm so steady that each day seemed to unfold exactly like the one before it. The mornings began early. Just after sunrise, the grounds would come alive in quiet, familiar ways. The kitchen staff lit the stoves. The housemaids opened the shutters. Gardeners moved slowly across the lawns, trimming hedges and tending flower beds that bordered the long stone walkways. And almost every morning, Edward Harrow could be seen outside among the gardens. Even in old age, he kept the habit of walking the grounds before breakfast. He moved carefully along the gravel paths, inspecting the hedges, pausing at the rose bushes, occasionally speaking to the gardeners about the condition of the grounds. It was one of the routines the staff had come to expect. Margaret Harrow kept to her own routines inside. By mid-morning, she was usually in the sunroom or the main dining room, where breakfast was served at the same hour every day. The household ran with quiet precision. Meals were prepared on schedule. Rooms were cleaned in order. Deliveries arrived on the same days each week. There was comfort in the repetition. The estate was large, but life within it was orderly and calm. To the servants, the rhythm of the house felt permanent. Breakfast in the morning room. Fresh flowers arranged in the hallway. Silver polished in the pantry. Tea served in the dining room each afternoon. Evenings spent in the study with the curtains drawn. The Harrows spoke little, but their expectations were clear. Everything had its place. Every task had its hour. And every person in the house understood the rules. One of those rules concerned the upstairs hallway. The upper floor held guest rooms, storage rooms, and private family chambers. The staff cleaned the hallways daily, dusting the frames of old family portraits and sweeping the long polished floors. But at the far end of the upper corridor stood one door that no one was permitted to touch. The instruction was simple: clean around it. Do not open it. Do not ask about it. The maids passed it every day carrying linens and wash basins. And the butler walked past it each evening while checking the upstairs lamps. The housekeeper inspected the hallway each morning, and every single day that door remained closed. It became part of the house's routine, just like everything else. No one knocked on it. No one entered. No one mentioned it unless absolutely necessary. To the newer servants, the rule seemed unusual. Most large houses had unused rooms, locked studies, or private storage areas. But this room was treated differently. Its brass handle was polished but untouched. Its frame was dusted, but the lock was never disturbed. And when servants asked questions, the answers were always the same. That room is private. Nothing more. In the beginning, the staff whispered about it among themselves. Young housemaids speculated while folding linens in the laundry room. Kitchen staff traded harmless theories while preparing dinner. Some thought it was an old family office. Others believed it held valuables. One maid claimed it was once a nursery. Another insisted it contained old records the family did not want disturbed. But these were no more than quiet guesses exchanged during routine work. No one treated the matter as frightening. The room was simply another family secret in a household built on privacy. And in a town where privacy was respected, questions were rarely pressed. The merchants who delivered goods to the estate saw only the polished public image. The baker arrived every Thursday morning. The butcher delivered meat before noon. A tailor from town came monthly to meet with Margaret Harrow. Each visitor was greeted by the same orderly household and the same quiet formality. To outsiders, the estate seemed peaceful. Nothing about it suggested mystery. Nothing about it suggested fear. The family appeared stable. The house appeared well kept. Life inside seemed untouched by trouble. Even the villagers spoke of the Harrows in calm, respectful tones. Edward was known as disciplined. Margaret was known as proper. Their daughter Eleanor was quiet and well-mannered. They were not seen as strange. They were simply reserved. And so, when townspeople spoke of the locked room, it was often with mild curiosity rather than suspicion. At the general store, people occasionally mentioned it in passing. One neighbor might say the Harrows kept part of the upstairs closed off. Another might guess it was storage. Someone else might laugh and suggest every old house needed one mystery. The conversations were brief and harmless. The locked room was treated as an odd detail, not a cause for concern. Even Eleanor, as a child growing up in the estate, seemed to accept the arrangement as normal. She knew the upstairs room was off limits. She knew not to go near it. And, like everyone else in the household, she learned not to ask why. That silence became part of the house's order. Rules were not explained, they were followed. Over the years, the routine never changed. Morning gardening, meals served on time. Visitors arriving on schedule. Servants moving quietly through the halls. And at the far end of the upstairs corridor, the locked door remained exactly where it had always been. Closed, ignored. Protected by habit more than by force. That consistency gave the house its sense of calm. Nothing dramatic ever happened. There were no loud arguments. Yet no sudden departures. No visible signs that anything was wrong. The servants came to think of the locked room as furniture, always present, rarely noticed. New employees were informed of the rule on their first day. The senior housekeeper would explain the duties of the upstairs floor, then pause at the final instruction. The last room stays closed. No further explanation was offered, and after a while none was expected. The routine was so familiar that the locked door stopped drawing attention. The house moved around it as if it were a natural part of the estate. Even when repairs were needed in nearby rooms, the door was left untouched. When wallpaper was replaced in the upstairs hall, workers were instructed not to disturb it. When carpets were cleaned, the cleaner stopped at its threshold. Yet when locks in other parts of the house were changed, that one remained the same. The message was clear. Whatever was behind that door was not to be disturbed. Yet life in the estate remained calm. There was no sense of alarm attached to the rule. Only routine. Only repetition. That was what made the house feel safe. The servants trusted the order of the household. The villagers trusted the reputation of the family. And the locked room became part of the background of daily life. Years passed this way. Seasons changed outside the estate windows. Gardens bloomed and faded. Staff members came and went. Eleanor grew older. Edward and Margaret aged with the house. Still, the routine held. Every day repeated the last. The house remained orderly. The family remained respected. And the locked room remained closed. In that repetition, the estate felt secure, predictable, untouched by disruption. No one imagined that the quiet order of the house concealed anything unusual, because when a mystery is wrapped in routine, it becomes invisible. The locked room was seen every day, yet it was never truly noticed. And that silence, maintained year after year, made the room seem harmless, But the longer a secret is left undisturbed, the more deeply it becomes part of the walls around it. By the time anyone thought to question what lay behind the upstairs door, the silence surrounding it had already lasted decades. And in a house where every other room was part of daily life, the one room left untouched had become something else entirely. Not frightening, not suspicious, simply absent. A blank space in the life of the estate, a space no one entered, a space no one explained, and a space that would remain sealed until the routines that protected it finally came to an end. For years, life inside the estate moved with such consistency that even the smallest irregularity stood out. A delayed breakfast tray, an unfamiliar visitor, a door left open that was usually closed. In a house built on routine, small details were noticed, and it was through those small details that the first questions about the locked upstairs room began to take shape. At first, the changes were easy to dismiss. One of the maids working the evening shift mentioned hearing movement from the upper floor after everyone had retired for the night. The sound was faint. Slow footsteps above the hallway ceiling. Just a few quiet creaks, as if someone were pacing across old wooden boards. The house was old, and old houses made noise. Floorboards shifted, pipes rattled, doors settled in their frames. No one thought much of it, but then the sounds came again. Another servant heard them a few nights later while extinguishing lamps on the ground floor. The footsteps were measured and deliberate. Not the random noises of a settling house, but the sound of movement. Steady, controlled, and unmistakably human. The servant paused, listened for a moment, then said nothing. In a household where privacy was respected, unexplained sounds were easier to ignore than to question. And by morning, the moment was dismissed as imagination. But the sounds continued. They were never loud, never dramatic. Only soft movement overhead, heard late at night when the rest of the estate had gone quiet. Sometimes it was pacing. Sometimes the faint scrape of something shifting across the floor. Always brief. Always behind the locked door. Still, no one was ever seen entering the room. The upstairs corridor remained empty. The servants knew who moved through the house and when. Edward retired to his study in the evenings. Margaret remained downstairs until bedtime. Eleanor slept in a room on the opposite side of the upper floor. No staff member carried keys to the locked room. No guest had access to that part of the hall. And yet, from behind the sealed door, and the sounds appeared from time to time as though the room were occupied. When one of the younger maids finally asked the housekeeper about it, the answer came quickly. "The room is empty." Nothing more. The statement was clear and firm. There was no room for further questions. But the explanation did not fit what the staff were hearing. If the room was empty, why did footsteps come from inside? Why did the floorboards creak as if someone were walking there after midnight? No one had an answer. And because no one wished to challenge the owners directly, the question was left hanging in silence. Then came another detail. On some evenings, servants noticed a thin line of light beneath the locked door. It was faint enough to miss unless the upstairs hallway was dark. A narrow glow at the base of the frame, as though a lamp had been lit inside. The first person to mention it assumed Margaret Harrow had entered the room privately. But no one saw her go upstairs. And on nights when the light appeared, the owners were accounted for elsewhere in the house. The housekeeper saw it once while checking the upstairs corridor before bed. A pale glow under the door. She stood for a moment, staring at it. Then she turned away and continued down the hall. The next morning, the light was gone. The door was closed as always. No one mentioned it. The estate was full of routines, but the locked room existed outside those routines. It was treated differently. And that difference made even simple observations feel like boundaries not meant to be crossed. Over time, the servants noticed another inconsistency. The house was old and difficult to maintain. Dust settled quickly across unused furniture. Hallway ledges and guest rooms left vacant for weeks at a time. Every part of the estate showed signs of age. Every part except the area directly outside the locked room. That section of hallway remained strangely clean. The brass handle was polished. The wood around the frame looked maintained. Even the floor near the threshold appeared free of the dust that gathered elsewhere upstairs. At first, the maids assumed the housekeeper cleaned it personally, but the housekeeper denied it. She insisted no one touch the door. That only deepened the quiet uncertainty among the staff. If no one was entering the room and no one was cleaning around it, why did the hallway outside remain so well kept? Again, no one pressed for answers. The household functioned on obedience, not explanation. Still, the small contradictions accumulated. The room was said to be empty. Yet footsteps were heard. No one entered. Yet light appeared beneath the door. No one cleaned there. Yet the hallway remained undisturbed. Each detail was minor on its own. Easy to explain away, easy to ignore. But together they created a quiet unease. The locked room no longer seemed like an unused family space. It began to feel active in some unseen way. And yet, daily life in the estate continued unchanged. Breakfast was served on time. The gardens were tended. Deliveries arrived each week. The routines remained intact. That normality made the strange details even harder to confront, because nothing else about the household suggested there was reason for concern. The Harrows remained calm. The staff carried out their duties. No one behaved as though anything unusual was happening. So, when one maid experienced something she could not explain, she hesitated before telling anyone. It happened late one evening while she was bringing fresh linens to an upstairs room. The hallway was dark except for a single lamp near the staircase. As she passed the locked door, she stopped. From inside, she heard voices. Not loud, just low, hushed sounds, too soft to make out clearly. She stood still, listening. The voices seemed to overlap, like a whispering conversation on the other side of the wall. She could not understand the words, only the sound of voices where there should have been silence. She remained there for several seconds, frozen in the hallway, listening to the faint murmur behind the locked door. Then the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was immediate, but she hurried downstairs and reported what she had heard to the housekeeper. The reaction was not surprise. It was warning. The housekeeper listened, then told her never to repeat what she had heard. No explanation was offered, no reassurance was given, only a firm instruction. Do not mention it again. The maid obeyed, but word spread quietly among the staff. Not as gossip, but as unease. The warning mattered more than the whispering itself. If there was nothing behind the locked door, why respond with silence instead of explanation? Why insist that the matter be forgotten? The questions grew, but no one spoke of them openly. In the estate, silence was part of the structure of daily life. Rules were followed. Boundaries were respected. And whatever truth lay behind the locked room remained protected by that silence. Days passed, then weeks, and the strange details continued in small ways. A sound in the night, a faint light, the sense that the room was not as empty as the owners claimed. No single event was dramatic enough to force confrontation. Nothing undeniable ever happened. Only quiet contradictions that slowly unsettled the people who lived and worked in the house. And that made the uncertainty harder to escape. Because when fear has no clear shape, it settles into the ordinary. The staff still walked the upstairs hallway every day. They still passed the locked door in silence. But now they did so with hesitation. They listened for sounds. They noticed the light beneath the frame. They looked at the clean floorboards outside the threshold, and each detail made the next one harder to dismiss. Yet the room remained closed. No explanation came. And the silence of the owners only made the unanswered questions heavier. By then, the locked room was no longer just a family rule. It had become the one part of the estate where the normal order of the house no longer made sense. The house remained calm, but the certainty that had once defined life there had begun to weaken. And once routine begins to break, even quietly, every unanswered question becomes harder to ignore. As the months passed, the small irregularities surrounding the locked upstairs room became harder for the staff to ignore. The noises that had once been occasional began to happen more often. At first, a servant might hear movement once every few weeks. Then it became once every few nights. Soon the sounds were regular enough that several members of the household had noticed the same thing. Late in the evening, when the downstairs lamps were dimmed and the estate settled into silence, footsteps could be heard from the upper hallway. Sometimes the sound was slow pacing, Sometimes it was the shifting scrape of something dragged lightly across the floor. Other times it was no more than the sound of boards creaking under a measured weight. Each time the sound came from the same place. Behind the locked door, the staff did what they had always done. They continued their duties, they followed instructions, and they said as little as possible. But even in silence, tension was beginning to spread through the house. The younger servants, especially those assigned to evening work, became uneasy about going upstairs alone. A maid carrying linens would pause at the foot of the staircase and listen before climbing. The butler making his final rounds at night began moving more quickly through the upper corridor. Servants who once treated the locked room as an odd but harmless detail now found themselves watching the door as they passed. No one spoke openly in front of the owners. But in the kitchens, in the laundry rooms, and in the servants' quarters, the conversations changed. The room was no longer just a private family matter. It had become the source of a growing anxiety that no one could explain. What made it worse was that the family's behavior began to change as well. Edward Harrow, once formal but calm, became sharper whenever the upstairs room was mentioned. If a servant asked an innocent question about cleaning the upper hallway, his answers became brief. If anyone lingered near the far end of the corridor, he noticed, Margaret Harrow became equally guarded. Her instructions regarding the upstairs hallway were repeated more often and in firmer terms. The room was not to be approached. The room was not to be discussed. The room was not to be disturbed. The repetition of those rules only gave them more weight. The staff understood that something had changed. The owners were not merely protecting privacy, they were guarding something. And the tension created by that silence reached the Harrow's daughter as well. Eleanor had grown up in the house, surrounded by its routines and rules. But as the unease around the locked room grew, one thing became impossible for the staff to ignore. Eleanor refused to go near it. Even as an adult, she avoided the upper hallway's far end completely. If she needed something from one of the nearby rooms, she sent a servant instead. If she walked upstairs, she turned back before reaching the locked door. On one occasion, a maid recalled seeing Eleanor stop halfway down the hall, freeze at the sound of movement behind the locked door, and quietly retreat without saying a word. It was not anger. It was not indifference. It was fear. That reaction unsettled the staff more than any sound from behind the door. Because if Eleanor, the heir to the estate, feared what lay inside, then whatever was being hidden was not simply an old family secret. Still, no answers came. The routines of the house continued, but beneath them was a tension that seemed to grow with each passing week. Then came the first event no one could dismiss. One morning, a maid assigned to dust the upstairs corridor found the locked door slightly open, only by an inch, just enough to break the line of the frame. She stopped in the hallway and stared. For as long as she had worked in the house, the door had never been anything but firmly shut. The sight of that narrow opening felt wrong, as though something impossible had appeared in the middle of an ordinary task. She did not touch the handle. She did not look inside. She simply stepped back and went downstairs to report it. When the housekeeper returned with her a short time later, the door was closed again. The brass handle was still. The lock was in place. There was no sign it had ever been opened. The housekeeper said nothing. She inspected the frame for a moment, then ordered the maid back to work. The incident was never mentioned again, but by then, silence was no longer enough to calm the fears spreading through the household. Because if the door had opened, someone had opened it, and no one admitted doing so. The story moved quietly through the servants' quarters that evening. Voices were lowered. Questions were whispered. If the room was empty, who had opened the door? And why had it been closed again before anyone else saw? The uncertainty spread beyond the estate. In small towns, unusual details travel quickly, even when no one speaks of them openly. The Harrow family's privacy had protected them for years, but servants talked to relatives, relatives spoke to neighbors, and neighbors passed along what little they knew. Before long, villagers were speculating about the locked room. At first, the theories were harmless. Some believed the room held valuables, family heirlooms, money, or documents too important to expose. Others guessed it was tied to some private tragedy the family wished to forget. But as more stories spread, the rumors became darker. Some said the Harrows were hiding evidence of an old crime. Others believed a family member had once been shut away upstairs. A few whispered that someone was still being kept there. No one had proof. No one knew the truth. But in the absence of answers, rumor filled the silence. The locked room, once an odd detail of the estate, became the center of every whispered conversation about the Harrow family. The servants heard the rumors and carried them back into the house. And with each new theory, the atmosphere inside the estate grew heavier. The staff still worked. The floors were still polished. Meals were still served. But fear had begun to settle into the daily routine. People moved more quietly. They avoided being alone upstairs. They watched the locked door as though expecting it to move. And then one servant decided to do what no one else had dared. He was a young footman, only recently hired, less bound by the unspoken rules that kept the older staff silent. Late one evening, after hearing movement behind the locked door, he remained in the hallway after the others had gone downstairs. The house was quiet. The corridor was dim. He stood in front of the door, listening. At first, there was nothing. And then came a soft sound from inside, something shifting across the floor. He moved closer. The old lock had a keyhole large enough to peer through. For several seconds, he hesitated. Then he bent down and looked inside. At first, he saw very little. The room was dim. Furniture shapes stood under white coverings draped in cloth that had gathered dust over the years. The outlines of chairs and tables sat motionless beneath the fabric. It looked like a room abandoned long ago. Then his eyes adjusted, and near the far side of the room, in a chair facing the wall, he saw what looked like a person sitting motionless beneath a white covering. The shape was unmistakable. A human form seated upright, still and silent. The servant pulled back immediately. He stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the locked door. There had been no movement, no sound, just the outline of what appeared to be someone seated in the room. He said nothing that night, but the next morning he gave notice that he was leaving the estate. When asked why, he refused to explain. He only said he would not go upstairs again. His sudden departure unsettled the rest of the staff. They knew he had seen something, and whatever it was had frightened him enough to abandon his position without warning. By then, curiosity had given way to dread. The noises, the brief opening of the door, the owner's silence, Eleanor's fear, the rumors in town, each detail added to a pattern no one could explain. The staff no longer wondered if something unusual was happening behind the locked door. They were certain that it was. But certainty brought no answers, only more fear. Because the one thing that remained unchanged through all of it was the silence of the family. No explanation, no denial, no reassurance. Only the locked door at the end of the hall, closed as always. And the longer it remained shut, the more the unanswered questions seemed to grow inside the house itself. By then, everyone in the estate understood the same truth. Whatever was in that room was being hidden deliberately, and no one knew why. In the years that followed, the routines that had governed life inside the estate slowly came to an end. Edward Harrow died first. By then, age had reduced the once orderly household to only a few remaining staff members. The gardens were no longer maintained as carefully as before. Entire wings of the estate sat unused. The silence in the house deepened. Now Margaret Harrow remained in the estate after her husband's death, but only for a short time. Within a few years, she too was gone. With both owners dead, the estate passed entirely to their daughter Eleanor. By then, the house was already in decline. The size of the property, the cost of repairs, and the years of deferred maintenance had made the estate impossible to preserve in the way her parents once had. Rooms had begun to deteriorate. The roof leaked in places. Wallpaper peeled from the walls. Dust gathered in the corners of rooms no one entered anymore. The house that had once symbolized order and stability had become too large, too old, and too expensive to maintain. For a time, Eleanor left it standing exactly as it was. The house remained locked and empty. Months became years, and the estate sat abandoned behind its stone walls while the grounds grew wild around it. The gardens disappeared beneath weeds. Rain damaged the upper floors. Paint faded. Windows darkened. The Harrow estate, once a symbol of prestige, became a quiet relic on the edge of town. Eventually, Eleanor made the decision she had avoided for years. She would sell the property, But before it could be listed, the house needed to be inspected and repaired. Contractors were hired to assess the damage, clear out unused rooms, and begin the long process of restoring the estate. For the renovation workers, it began as an ordinary job. An old country house, neglected rooms, a long list of repairs. They moved through the estate one room at a time, unlocking storage areas, clearing dust-covered furniture, documenting water damage, opening spaces that had been sealed for years. Then they reached the upstairs hallway. At the far end stood the same locked door that had remained shut for decades. Even Eleanor, now the legal owner of the estate, had no key for it. She reportedly told the workers that the room had been locked since her childhood. No one had entered in over 40 years. Whatever was inside had been left untouched since the days her parents still lived in the house. The workers first searched for a key among the estate's old belongings. In a downstairs study inside the drawer of an antique writing desk, they found a small rusted key attached to a yellowed tag with no label. It was the only old key in the desk. When they brought it upstairs, the metal was worn and dark with age. The lock itself had not been turned in decades. The first attempt failed. The mechanism resisted. The workers tried again, forcing the key slowly into place. With pressure, the lock finally shifted. The sound echoed sharply through the silent hallway, but when they turned the handle, the door still would not open. The wood had swollen in the frame over years of being sealed. The workers pushed against it, and after repeated force, the door finally gave way. It opened only inches at first. A rush of stale air escaped from the room, air that had remained trapped for decades. The smell was dry, closed, untouched. The workers forced the door wider, and what they saw inside stopped them in place. The room was intact. Unlike the rest of the estate, where time and neglect were visible everywhere, this room appeared preserved. The furniture stood exactly where it had been placed years earlier, and a wardrobe remained closed against one wall. A small writing desk sat near the window. Curtains hung in place, faded but undisturbed. Books rested on shelves untouched by time. Nothing had been overturned. Nothing had been removed. It looked less like an abandoned room and more like a space waiting for someone to return. Dust covered the surfaces, but the room remained strangely orderly. Personal belongings were arranged neatly. Clothing hung inside the wardrobe. Photographs remained on the bedside table. Small decorative items sat untouched on shelves. The room felt frozen in time, and at the center of it stood a bed. Its blankets were folded neatly. The pillows were arranged in place. The bed appeared made, not collapsed by time, not stripped for storage. Made. As though the room had been prepared for use and then left undisturbed. That detail unsettled the workers immediately, because every other room in the estate showed the wear of abandonment. Sheets were missing, furniture was covered, dust lay thick on every unused bed in the house. Yet here, the bed looked cared for. The workers continued their inspection, moving carefully through the room. Drawers were opened, closets were checked, boxes beneath the bed were pulled into the light. What they found began to explain why the room had remained hidden. Inside a cabinet near the writing desk were several journals. The leather covers were cracked with age, but the pages inside had been preserved. The entries were written by Edward and Margaret Harrow. At first, the notes appeared ordinary. Medical observations, daily records, short household details. But as the workers and Eleanor examined the journals, a darker truth emerged. The room had belonged to the Harrows' eldest child, a child no one in town had ever known existed. The journals described years of isolation, references to keeping the child safe, mentions of protecting the family from public knowledge. Detailed records of food deliveries brought to the room, daily notes on behavior, health observations, instructions to maintain privacy at all costs. Page after page documented the life of someone hidden away inside the estate. The entries suggested the child had lived in that room for years, unseen by visitors, unknown to the town, separated from the rest of the household. No explanation was written clearly. No diagnosis was recorded in direct terms, but the meaning was unavoidable. Edward and Margaret had concealed the existence of their eldest child and kept them inside that room in secret. The journals ended abruptly. The final entries described illness, then silence. The child had died decades earlier. No later entries followed. No records explained what happened afterward. Only the preserved room remained. The discovery alone was enough to shock everyone involved. The locked room was no longer just a mystery. It was evidence of a hidden life erased from the family's public history. But the workers soon noticed details that made the discovery even harder to understand. The room should have shown 40 years of abandonment, yet some parts of it did not. Near the bed, footprints were visible in the dust on the wooden floor. Clear marks leading from the door toward the rocking chair near the window, and the workers assumed the prints belonged to someone who had entered recently. But the dust elsewhere in the room was undisturbed. No one could explain why those marks were there. Then one worker noticed movement near the far corner of the room. A wooden rocking chair beside the window was shifting gently back and forth. Only slightly. Slowly. The windows were closed. The air in the room was still. Yet the chair moved as if someone had risen from it only moments before. No one spoke for several seconds. The room remained silent. The journals lay open on the bed. Dust hung motionless in the air, and the chair continued its slow movement before gradually coming to rest. There was no dramatic event, no sudden sound, no visible figure. Only the quiet suggestion that the room had not been as untouched as it first appeared. That moment changed the meaning of everything they had found. The hidden child had died decades earlier. The room had been sealed for 40 years. And yet, signs within the room suggested recent presence. The neatly made bed, the footprints in the dust, the moving chair. Each detail alone might have been dismissed. Together they transformed the discovery from tragic to deeply unsettling. Because the room had not felt abandoned, it felt occupied, and standing in that preserved bedroom, surrounded by the private history of a hidden life, the workers were forced to confront a question no journal could answer. If the child had died decades ago, who or what had been moving inside the locked room? For several moments after the discovery, no one inside the room spoke. The workers stood in silence, each surrounded by the carefully preserved belongings, the open journals, and the unsettling stillness of a room that should have been lifeless. What had begun as a routine renovation had turned into the uncovering of a hidden family history, one that no one in town had ever suspected. The atmosphere inside the estate changed immediately. The workers who had entered the room first stepped back into the hallway in stunned silence. The renovation stopped that same day. No one continued clearing rooms. No furniture was moved. No repairs were made. The project that had been planned for months came to a halt within hours. Even the contractors who had worked in the house for weeks refused to continue until the room was examined by authorities. The discovery inside the locked room had raised questions too serious to ignore. The journals were gathered carefully and taken downstairs. Eleanor, who had remained outside while the workers entered, was told what had been found. The reports describe her reaction as one of disbelief. She had known the room existed. She had known it was forbidden. But she had never been told what had happened inside. The journals revealed the existence of an older sibling she had never known about. A child erased so completely from the family's history that even the family's only surviving heir had grown up unaware. The emotional weight of that revelation was immediate. The locked room was no longer a symbol of secrecy. It was proof of a hidden tragedy at the center of the family's history. According to those present, Eleanor refused to enter the room after learning what had been found, but she remained downstairs while the journals were examined. When asked later if she wanted to see the room herself, she declined. The door that had remained closed throughout her childhood had finally been opened, yet she would not cross its threshold. For the workers, the discovery left a similar effect. Several of them left the property early that day. Some refused to return at all. The reasons were not dramatic. No one described panic. No one claimed to have witnessed anything impossible. But those who had entered the room spoke of a feeling they could not explain. A sense that the room was not simply abandoned, but occupied in some lingering way. That unease stayed with them even after they left the estate. By the next day, local authorities had been notified. The journals were handed over for review. And because the entries described years of confinement involving a child whose existence had never been publicly acknowledged, investigators needed to determine whether any crime had been committed. The house itself was temporarily closed while the room and its contents were documented. But the records in the journals were decades old. The child described in the entries had died long before. Edward and Margaret Harrow were already dead. No witnesses remained who could explain the decisions recorded in those pages. There would be no trial, no public confession, no formal resolution. Only written evidence of a secret kept behind a locked door for 40 years. When news of the journals spread, the reaction in town was immediate. For generations, the Harrow family had been seen as private but respectable. They had been pillars of the community, wealthy, reserved, admired. Now that image collapsed almost overnight. The respected estate at the edge of town became the center of public shock. People who had once defended the family's privacy began re-examining everything they remembered. Former staff recalled the sounds in the upstairs hallway. Neighbors remembered the family's unusual secrecy. Old rumors that had once seemed harmless suddenly carried new meaning. The whispers about the locked room were no longer gossip. They were part of a hidden history that had finally been exposed. Villagers spoke about the signs they had ignored for years. The servants' unease, the strict rules, the sounds at night, the lights under the door. Every unexplained detail from the past was now viewed differently. Events once dismissed as imagination or household eccentricity were reinterpreted as signs of what had been concealed upstairs. And yet, even after the truth about the hidden child became known, the most disturbing details remained unexplained. The journals revealed why the room had been sealed, but they did not explain the fresh signs of activity inside. No one could account for the footprints in the dust. Investigators documented them, but no one identified where they had come from. The room had supposedly remained closed for 40 years. The only people known to have entered were the workers who forced the door, yet the prints were already there when the room was opened. No one explained why the bed appeared recently made. No one explained why the rocking chair had been moving in a room with no open windows and no airflow. Those details were noted, discussed, and then left unresolved. The official focus remained on the journals and what they revealed. The physical signs inside the room had no clear explanation, and without evidence of recent entry, investigators could offer none. But the unease surrounding the room deepened in the days that followed. Several workers reported hearing footsteps upstairs after the discovery. The renovation had stopped. No one was living in the house. Yet late in the evening, while inventory was being completed downstairs, workers heard movement from the upper floor, and the sounds were familiar, slow footsteps crossing old floorboards. The same kind of movement servants had reported decades earlier. At first, the workers assumed someone had gone upstairs, but when they checked, the hallway was empty. The locked room remained open, but no one was inside. The room appeared exactly as it had earlier that day. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had changed. The footsteps were heard again the next evening, then once more the day after. Always at night, always on the upper floor, and always with no visible source. None of the workers claimed to know what caused the sounds, but several refused to remain in the house after dark. By then, the room's tragic history and its unexplained activity had become impossible to separate. The journals had provided answers, but those answers had opened new questions. If the hidden child had died decades earlier, why did the room still show signs of use? Why had footsteps continued after the room was opened? Why did the room still feel inhabited? No official report could answer those questions, and with no explanation, fear quietly took the place of certainty. Eleanor was eventually forced to make a decision about the estate. The discovery had already destroyed any chance of a normal sale. The family name had been publicly damaged. The property itself had become associated with the hidden room and the unexplained reports that followed. No buyer wanted the estate. No contractor wanted to continue renovations. The upstairs room, once sealed by her parents, had become the center of a mystery no one wanted to confront. In the end, the decision was made to close it again. The journals were removed. Here the room was documented. Then the door was shut and locked once more. Not as part of an investigation, not to preserve evidence, but because no one wanted to leave it open. The workers sealed the room and left the estate unfinished. The upper hallway returned to silence. The house stood empty once again, but the meaning of that silence had changed. For 40 years, the locked room had hidden a family secret. Now it held something else, a truth that had been uncovered, and a mystery that remained. Because the room explained what had happened decades earlier. It did not explain what was happening now. And in the end, that unanswered question was what stayed with everyone who had entered. The hidden child was gone. The family was gone. The truth was finally known. Yet the room still felt occupied, so the door was locked again, and behind it, even the silence returned. In the years after the discovery, the Harrow estate remained standing. The house was never fully restored. Though parts of the property were repaired enough to prevent further collapse, the estate never returned to the life it once held. The gardens were cut back, the roof was reinforced, the outer walls were repaired where weather had begun to break them down. But inside, much of the house remained untouched. Hallways stayed empty, guest rooms remained closed. Entire sections of the estate were left in silence. The property changed ownership quietly. The Harrow name, once spoken with admiration in the town, faded into the past. The new owners inherited the land, the house, and the long history attached to it. They were aware of what had been found. They knew about the locked room upstairs. And they knew what the journals had revealed. And according to those familiar with the estate, they made one decision almost immediately. The upstairs room would not be used. No furniture was moved into it. No renovations were completed there. The room remained shut, preserved much as it had been when it was first reopened. The rest of the estate could be repaired. That room would remain untouched. There was no legal reason for the decision. No official restriction. Only the quiet choice to leave the room alone. Workers hired for repairs in later years reportedly avoided the upper hallway whenever possible. Maintenance was completed in other parts of the house, but the far end of the upstairs corridor was left exactly as it was. Even among people who did not believe the stories, the room had acquired a kind of presence. Not because of what had been proven, but because of what no one could explain. The journals answered part of the mystery. They revealed the hidden life that had once existed inside that room. They exposed the secret the Harrow family had concealed for decades. But the journals explained only the past. They did not explain the footprints. They did not explain the movement in the chair. They did not explain the footsteps heard after the room was opened. And because those details remained unanswered, the room never fully became ordinary again. Over time, new stories began to circulate. They were quiet stories, shared cautiously among neighbors and workers familiar with the property. Some claimed that on certain nights a faint light could still be seen in the upstairs window. The room had no electricity. No one was supposed to enter it. Yet from outside the estate, people occasionally reported seeing a dim glow behind the glass. The stories were never confirmed. Sometimes the light was blamed on reflections. Sometimes on passing headlights. Sometimes on imagination shaped by the house's history. But the reports continued. A soft light in the same upstairs room, visible only at night, gone by morning. Others described hearing movement from the upper floor when no one was staying in that part of the house. A creak in the ceiling, the sound of slow footsteps crossing the boards above. Nothing dramatic, nothing undeniable, only the same kinds of sounds that had once been dismissed decades earlier. No one claimed to know whether those reports were true. No official investigation followed. No evidence was ever produced beyond the repeated accounts of those who believed they had seen or heard something. But the fact that the stories persisted mattered in its own way. Because once a place becomes tied to an unanswered question, every unexplained detail gains meaning. The estate itself became defined not only by what had happened there, but by what could not be explained afterward. To some, the locked room represented nothing more than the remains of a hidden tragedy. A preserved bedroom, a painful family secret, a place burdened by memory. The sounds, the lights, the movement, these could all be explained as coincidence, misinterpretation, or the natural effect of fear in an old house filled with unsettling history. That explanation was enough for many people, but not for everyone, because for those who entered the room, and for those who later encountered the same strange details, the house carried a different meaning. They did not describe the room as abandoned. They described it as occupied, not by something seen, not by something that could be named, but by the sense that the room had never truly been empty. That feeling was impossible to prove, yet it shaped every decision that followed. The room was closed again. The room was left untouched. And even after the truth of the family secret was uncovered, no one chose to reclaim the space. It remained preserved in silence, as if opening it once had been enough. Today, the estate still stands, older and quieter than before. Its history is known now. The mystery of the hidden child is no longer secret. But the room at the end of the upstairs hallway remains closed. Visitors are not brought there. Workers avoid it. And those who know the story rarely speak about it for long. Because even with the facts laid bare, the final question was never answered. Were the strange signs in that room simply the remnants of a forgotten life? Or had something remained behind? No journal explained the footprints in the dust. No witness explained the movement in the chair. No report explained the footsteps heard in an empty house. The room revealed a truth, but it also left a silence that truth could not fill. And perhaps that is why the room was sealed again. Not to hide what was discovered, but because some places remain unsettled even after their secrets are known. The old estate still stands in the quiet countryside, its upper windows dark against the night. Most evenings, nothing moves behind the glass. No sound breaks the silence. No light appears. But now and then, according to those who still pass the estate after dark, one upstairs window seems to glow faintly for a while before fading again. No one has confirmed it. No one has explained it. And no one has opened the room again. The locked room remained closed for 40 years before its secret was uncovered. It was opened once, then sealed again. And even now, when night settles over the old estate, some say the light in that upstairs window still returns.